Welcome to the webinar on the separate customs territory of the Hong Kong SAR and WTO. The webinar is organized by the Asian Academy of International Law in collaboration with the Hong Kong Chinese Enterprise Association Legal Affairs Steering Committee. My name is Adrian Lai, the moderator of today's webinar. This webinar is bilingual. You can select your own channel, either Chinese or English. On the 15th of July, the US President Donald Trump ended the Hong Kong special status under their domestic law, saying that the US will treat Hong Kong the same as mainland. On the 11th of August, the US government declared that all goods made in Hong Kong must be marked to indicate their origin as China. The order, originally coming into effect a few days before the 25th of September, was postponed to 9th of November. Needless to say, the measure was met with strong objection by the Hong Kong government. The government considers that the measure disregards Hong Kong's status as a separate member of WTO, and the measure violates the WTO rules. On the 16th of September, the Hong Kong government formally took issue with the US government over the measure and delivered the written demand to the US Trade Representative via the acting US Consul General to demand that the new measure be withdrawn. Similar actions were taken by the Hong Kong representatives in Washington, D.C. and Geneva. Secretary Edward Yao indicated that if the US government refused to withdraw the new measure and the bilateral discussion failed to resolve the dispute, the Hong Kong government would take action against the US government in accordance with the WTO dispute settlement mechanism. As of today, the Hong Kong government has not yet formally invoked the WTO dispute resolution procedure against the US government. If it did, it would become the second case Hong Kong government making use of the WTO procedure as a complainant since its first request for consultation back in 1996 against Turkey. Tonight, we have three distinguished speakers to enlighten us what Hong Kong is to expect if it decides to embark on the WTO dispute process. In Geneva, Switzerland, we have Mr. Stuart Harbinson, Senior Consultant of International Trade of Hombrofi. Mr. Harbinson is closely connected to Hong Kong. He served as a senior government trade policy official and negotiator back in 1980s and 1990s. He was Hong Kong's representative to the WTO from 1994 to 2002. Later became the Chief of Staff and subsequently the Special Advisor to the two Directors General of WTO. He also has chaired high-level WTO bodies, including the Dispute Settlement Body and the General Council, and as well as a number of dispute settlement panels. Back to Hong Kong, we have Professor Lim Chin Ling. Professor Lim is a good friend of AAIL. He is a member of the Keating Chambers London, has advised and represented governments and private clients in complex public and private international law matters and disputes. He has also served as on advisory committee of the Trade and Industry Department of the Hong Kong SAR. So in short, Professor Lim is a perfect combination of a gentle professor, a fierce advocate, and of course, an humble advisor. Last but not least, of course, we have our chairman, Dr. Anthony Neil, Senior Counsel. Tony is the chairman of AIL. Members will know that Tony is a senior member of the bar and has devoted his professional life to serving not just the Hong Kong, but also the nation. He has extensive knowledge on international trade and finance. So without further ado, I yield the floor to Tony. Tony is going to set the scene for us by taking us back to the history of the GATT and WTO, the impact of the WTO on the world trade, some figures on the Hong Kong-US trade, and the Hong Kong capacity to enter into agreement with other countries and jurisdictions under the basic law framework. Tony.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go into some history, and it's great to be sharing this forum with my very old friend Stuart Harbinson, and we worked together many years ago in the Hong Kong government, and rather dates the both of us. And of course with Chin, Professor Lang from the Chinese University. What I'd like to do is to start with some history as to where it all started, when it all started, and why it all started. Late in 1947, there was a meeting in Geneva when one of the 4 post-war institutions were promoted by the United States of America. And one of the 4 post-war institutions was the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. In fact, that was just the agreement. The organization that the United States wanted to promote was actually called the International Trade Organization, the ITO. But then people didn't come to agreement. There wasn't enough agreement to form the ITO, but there was enough agreement to actually accede to a general agreement on trade and tariffs. Now, why was that so? It came into effect on January 1948. As I've said, it's one of the 4 institutions. The other 3, well known to you, of course, is the United Nations, which started, of course, with the San Francisco Conference in 1945, then the Bretton Woods Agreement with the IMF, and then, of course, the Washington Agreement with the World Bank. And this, the 4th one, in Geneva in 1947. Now, the idea behind the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs is the liberalization of trade. Now, what does that mean? It essentially means actually the ability of trading nations to go into each other's markets with as little friction as possible. And the friction in the old days was actually tariffs. And tariffs were very, very high in the interwar years before the Second World War, and that to a certain extent, precipitated the Second World War. And both between Japan and Germany with the rest of the world powers. And as a result, after the Second World War, it was thought that in order to rebuild the world, we need 4 important institutions. Money, which is the, of course, politics and diplomacy, which is the United Nations, money, which is the IMF, development, which is the World Bank, and free trade, which is the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. The idea behind the agreement, it wasn't a very, very long agreement when it first started. Now it's much longer, with many agreements attached to it. But it wasn't very long in the very beginning. And it was based essentially on 3 principles. The first principle was what is known, the essential principle was market access. But how do you deal with market access? What do you mean by this? And it was based on 3 principles, which is the first principle is reciprocity. If, for example, you put tariffs on your own market and you reduce it, then you have an agreement with the other party which should likewise reduce this so that each of you can actually employ the same benefits. But if you change that, then you're able then to renegotiate, in fact, a new equilibrium, a new kind of reciprocity. That was the basic principle behind this. Another principle is that if a member gives it to one nation, then it's got to give it to all nations who are members of the GATT. And this is called the most favored nation principle. And the third, which is very important, that if a particular nation or contracting party enters into your market, then that contracting party must have exactly the same kind of treatment as other organizations and enterprises within your own country. And that is called national treatment. Now, these are the 3 principles: reciprocity, most favored nation, national treatment, which has actually been, in fact, the cornerstone of the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. But when it first started, it didn't have an organization. It has a kind of secretariat, but it doesn't have an organization. And the reason why it had a secretariat, I'll come to in a second. But then, after a while, things didn't work all that well for 2 reasons. First of all, the many nations, particularly the European nations after the war, they began to form the European Union. Originally, it wasn't called the European, it was called the Common Market. And it was found that, in fact, as far as agricultural trade is concerned, there are really too many subsidies. And countries are saying that, well, you can't get into the system of the GATT, it's just too difficult. So it was then sort of taken out. So agricultural trade was originally taken out. The other thing which was taken out was actually, in fact, the trade in cotton textiles and in all kinds of textiles after a while, and the reason was very simple. Essentially, all the developing nations were developing their own textile industries. But you will probably remember, those who live in Hong Kong as long as I have, I've lived in Hong Kong since I was born in 1946, so rather dates me. But you see that when Hong Kong started as a post-war economy, most of our industry was actually in textiles. And this was the same with many countries, the same with India, with Pakistan, with many countries in Asia, and many South American countries as well. And as a result, the developing nations said, well, we can't take this. And they started to have a thing which was outside of the GATT called a multi-fiber arrangement, called the MFA. And that carried on for a very long time, from 1962 right up to 1994. And the idea of that was that countries which produce a lot of textiles, which would be developing countries, if they export to developed markets, then the developed markets would give them quotas. And Hong Kong was in fact the recipient of a lot of quotas. And remember, my friend Stuart has been negotiating a lot of these quotas for Hong Kong. And he tells me he remembers them fondly. Now, that was really the bread and butter, in fact, of trade officials in Hong Kong, right up to 1994. And in a moment, I'll tell you why it is 1994. But in 1983, something happened in Hong Kong. Now, what has happened in Hong Kong was that really the gold standard had by then, in fact, evaporated. In fact, the gold standard evaporated in 1974 with America actually giving it up. So the world began to have fiat currencies. In other words, central banks and governments were printing money. And as a result, in fact, the currency markets were not in good shape. And as a result, Hong Kong in 1983 got into what is now today called the linked exchange rate. In other words, 7.8 Hong Kong dollars to $1. And that basically placed Hong Kong in good shape, in fact, as international trade is concerned. Because essentially our money is US dollars, essentially, with ratio, but still US dollars. And as a result, in fact, trade then and even now, if you look at SWIFT, for example, which is, of course, the money messaging system in Hong Kong, 85% of global trade still settled in US dollars. And as a result, US dollars is so important, in fact, to Hong Kong trade. Now then in 1985, another thing happened, which is actually very, very important. In 1985, a thing called the Plaza Accord happened, which was in fact the United States of Germany, Japan, and France doing this. The US dollar was by then, in fact, 50% more than these European and Japanese currencies. And the terms of trade were turning against the United States. And as a result, the United States then got into an accord with these countries and say, well, you have to enter the currency markets and make sure that your currency, in fact, appreciate, in fact, to the level of the US dollar. And as a result of that, international trade began again because the terms of trade got evened out a bit more, and order returned to the market. Of course, after a lot of pushing by the American markets, of course, the Americans were the people who had, in fact, the expensive currency, and they got these people actually to actually buy their own currency back in the market so that their currency become expensive as well, and therefore equalize the terms of trade. So against the background of the exchange rate, linked exchange rate, and also the Plaza Accord, Hong Kong decided, after the signing of the Sino-British Agreement in 1985, in fact, with the sponsorship of the British government, to join, in fact, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. Now, why can Hong Kong join? Because that agreement does not require, in fact, sovereign nations to join as members. They only require, in fact, territories which, according to the rules of the International Customs Union, in fact, could be defined, in fact, as an independent customs territory. And as a result of that, Hong Kong joined the GATT in 1986, just at the right time. And that is because in 1986, in fact, Hong Kong has become, in fact, a very, very important, in fact, trade rerouting area and trading area for the whole of the Chinese southern area. And trade blossomed as a result of that, in fact. And Hong Kong, of course, has always been very much at the center of the MFA. And a lot of the rules, such as certificates of origin and so on and so forth, were developed by Hong Kong trade officials. In fact, people like Stuart, in fact, helped develop them. And as a result of that, we were in a good position to actually not only, in fact, play the rules, but actually have a function in actually making those rules. And we carried on. In fact, after we joined, we then, of course, became in 1994 a contracting party of the WTO. I'd like just to go to the next slide, just to give you an idea of what the WTO did, in fact, or not the WTO, what the GATT did until the time it became the WTO. What has happened is that within this period of 1947 to 1994, something like close to 50 years, in fact, the GATT has got itself into many rounds of negotiations among its members. And in fact, 9 rounds, starting from Geneva in 1947, all the way, in fact, nowadays to the Doha round. Now, when Hong Kong joined, in fact, in 1986, it was very much right at the beginning of the Uruguay round. And Hong Kong, in fact, took very, very active part. And I still remember Stuart, in fact, and his colleagues took a very, very active part in that. And as a result, we were actually at the table, in fact, in getting many of the rules and measures which the Uruguay round achieved. Some of the important things of the Uruguay round achieved, in fact, was really major reductions in tariffs. In fact, 40% of the tariffs were cut down around the world. So that gave a tremendous fillip to international trade. The other thing was, in fact, the access to agricultural subsidies was actually made a more rule-based system. And also, of course, the access to textiles was beginning to be liberalized. And as a result, in fact, by 1994, when the WTO, in fact, was formed, in fact, you don't need to have any more sort of quotas for textiles. And the MFA, in fact, sort of fell into its historical slot as something which is just history. So Hong Kong, in fact, did a great deal, in fact, in the formation of some of the rules of the GATT. Now, when let me then go back to this. When the GATT, when the GATT then transformed into the WTO in 1994, Hong Kong was was the original contracting parties. At that time, there was 123. In fact, so Hong Kong was a founding member of the WTO in 1994. And as a founding member, in fact, its position is essentially sort of baked into the whole framework of the GATT. Now, and the GATT at that point in time began to widen. What has widened, in fact, was that in addition, in fact, to an agreement on trade, there was an agreement on services. And when countries were beginning, in fact, to trade in services, there was a protocol on trade-related international intellectual property protection. It's called this TRIP. There was also a protocol on the trade-related investment measures called TRIMS. And an important one, which Hong Kong, in fact, very quickly, in fact, got into, was the government procurement agreement, which actually was very, very important, which is Hong Kong as an international market would welcome, in fact, international suppliers of government goods, in fact, including, of course, infrastructure and so on and so forth. And that was an important agreement for Hong Kong. Now, that was really right at the cusp of our return to our motherland in 1997. When Hong Kong, in fact, played an important role in international trade and also as an international financial as well as trading center. And that actually provided, in fact, I think the background and an important, foundation for China to join the WTO. I still remember my friend, Mr. Lung Yong To, and I see him from time to time when we give talks together in China. And he said that, Hong Kong's position in the WTO, that did help us, in fact, negotiate, in fact, our deal into the WTO. He was the chief negotiator, and straight from the horse's mouth on this. And of course, in Now, in 1992, there was the Hong Kong-US Relations Act, which of course essentially recognized Hong Kong's position actually as a member of the GATT, essentially. And that act, of course, was now, of course, somehow not only transformed, but actually to a certain extent, overtaken by the Hong Kong Autonomy Act. Now, throughout these years, what has happened, in fact, internationally, is that the GATT itself was important, but nonetheless, many countries have begun to form their own free trade agreements. And the most important one, of course, is the NAFTA agreement, which, of course, was renewed in 2020. The United States started its own Trans-Pacific Partnership, and China, of course, then started its own sort of regional cooperation and economic partnership. Now, Hong Kong, in fact, has quite a number of free trade agreements, the most important of which is actually CEPA, which I'll go into in a moment. Let me then just go very quickly into what the GATT has achieved. In fact, the GATT, there's now a growing economics literature on the importance of GATT to world trade. And I take this from Beckwell, who's one of the writers who's developing this literature. And it's shown us over these years, from 1948 to 1999, in fact, there's been, in fact, a tremendous percentage drop, in fact, in tariffs. And as a result, of course, the world trade has benefited as a result of that. Secondly, in terms of these major countries, when they started in 1952, you can see very, very big figures, double figures in terms. By the time of 2005, single figures and low single figures in terms of tariffs. And the other thing now, going to world rankings in terms of exports and imports, now Hong Kong, in fact, ranks as the world's eighth largest market in terms of exports, and also the eighth largest market in terms of imports. Now, the interesting thing about all of this is that a lot of these exports and imports get re-exported in Hong Kong. We don't sort of use a lot of the stuff that we import. In fact, we export a lot of that. And you can actually, and this is the figure, so I won't need it. You can actually see that here, that between 2010 and last year, in fact, we've imported quite a lot. You can see the blue line at the top is the import, but then we re-exported quite a lot of that out of Hong Kong, which is why Hong Kong is an important turnaround market for international trade. Now, our domestic exports have not really grown very much, and it's very, very little, actually. In fact, it's a little bit over 4 billion Hong Kong dollars, very, very little. And therefore, our trade balance has always been negative as a result. Now, let me just go into Hong Kong re-exports. Our re-export market in terms of origin, in other words, the goods coming to Hong Kong for re-export, mainly is China. You can see that the second largest market is actually Taiwan. Now, the US, in fact, is very, very small, only 3.5% of our re-export market. Now, our destination, going out, again, China is our major re-export market, and the US is 7.8. Now, then we go into the kinds of stuff, the kinds of goods. You can see that the most important goods that are re-exported are actually electronic goods and telecommunications equipment and office machines. Essentially, that's the stuff that comes through Hong Kong. They get sort of repackaged and then get rerouted, in fact, outside. Then we look at Hong Kong's domestic exports. Very small, in fact, Hong Kong's domestic exports. Now, this, in fact, is the amount that the US executive order or the trade representative order is dealing with at the moment. To the US, we only export a value of about 3.6 billion Hong Kong dollars in 2019. That's like 400 mil US dollars, actually. So that's not a very, very big sum. So we're talking about this sum, actually, right now. We're not talking about any other sum in terms of the sort of relabeling that people call this. So in fact, the US at the moment has actually sort of not done something very drastic. They've done something quite drastic in terms of our officials, the 11 officials and so on. But as far as this is concerned, it's not all that drastic. Now then, of course, we have imports. You see, we import a great amount of stuff. But then we re-export a lot of that at the moment. And our main import market, of course, is China. Now then we go into the next thing, which is the kind of goods that we import and export. Again, in terms of our exports, it's a miscellany of goods. But again, a lot of electronic goods in terms importing a lot of electronic goods and telecommunications equipment. Now, but then the next thing which is important now is Hong Kong has actually rebalanced from a manufacturing economy into a service economy. And you can see right now that our GDP in terms of manufacturing is only like less than 3%. In fact, all of that 97% is in services. And as a result, services is very important. And in terms of our external trade in services, and these are the latest statistics that we got from the Department of Trade and Industry, and you can see that essentially we are a net exporter of services right now, and we do therefore export more than we import services. Now, what kind of services that we're talking about, and where do we export? Now, in terms of our total trade in services, our main partner is actually China. Then our second partner is the United States in terms of services is concerned. The other thing which is important is in terms of import of services from China. Again, we import a great deal from China. Now, what do we import from China? Which is very, very interesting. We import manufacturing services from China, actually. And they actually, the stuff that we design, we make and so on, we give it to some guy across the border, and he makes it for us, basically. And which is why that's the sort of trades in services. The United States also provides trade in services to us, but that is not manufacturing. They provide financial services to us. And also transport services. Now, one of the things that you would find in this new executive order of President Trump is that he actually says that no more extradition, no more essentially no more extradition. Just a few in the executive order. Something which doesn't touch one very important thing. He doesn't actually stop the air services agreement. Now, that's a very, very important thing because the United States supply of services to us is mainly transport, and which is why he's not stopping that. Now, the other thing, again, in terms of export of services, we export a lot of financial services to the United States, and we export, in fact, four kinds of services to China. The first is financial services. The second is transport. The third is traveling. And the fourth is other businesses, which is actually accounting, legal, and so on. So China, in fact, is our biggest market in terms of export of services. Then finally, I'd like to just let you know that as far as the agreements in Hong Kong, and Chin will deal with Hong Kong's position, in fact, as far as international agreement making, but you see that Hong Kong, in fact, has a number of important free trade agreements. The most important one is CEPA with China, which actually opens the door for our services and zero tariff goods, in fact, for both ways. Now, all of these, in fact, free trade agreements have zero tariff goods. But then you actually have to certify it comes from them or it comes from you. So in fact, those are certificate of origin rules, which actually were part of the certificate of origin rules of many countries. The other thing is that we have investment protection, promotion and protection agreements with 18 countries. And then you see, if you go to the website of the DOJ, that we have really a whole raft of agreements that Hong Kong has entered into with other countries in the name of Hong Kong and China, and also is the beneficiary of a whole raft of treaties which China, in fact, has entered into with the rest of the world. So I will stop here. I hope that this introduction of the history would help you then go into some of the more difficult parts of this talk.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you for setting the scene for the audience to understand tonight's more topical, thorny issues. So, all members of the audience, I think there's a button for Q&A. You can always write up your questions to us in the course of the presentations, and we'll collate all the questions and then deal with them at the end of the session. So, the next speaker is Professor Lim. Initially, I had some hesitation to invite Professor to speak because I'm told that he's going to take us to 5 myths of WTO and GATT. But On reflection and having a second thought, with this perfect combination of three identities I've just mentioned, a gentle professor, fierce advocate, and a humble advisor, I'm confident that Professor Lim will guide us through those confusing map and clarify the doubts that we may have. Professor Lim.
Thank you, Adrian, and thank you for this kind invitation. Thank you also to Tony, who chairs AAIL, and for leading us in so smoothly, and to Dora and other people that we can't see on the screen. Thanks very much, and it's always good to see Stuart. What I'm going to try to do is to explain this marking labeling issue against the fact that even in the last month and a half, we've seen various misunderstandings, even misrepresentations, myths, if you like, that have emerged around this issue. The 5 myths are, firstly, that it will be hard to argue discrimination in this case. The second is that the clause which governs Hong Kong's status somehow lies in the GATT. The third myth is that we're not really talking about where goods come from, we're only talking about how they are marked or how they are labeled. The fourth has to do with the idea that's been put about publicly that we really don't want to bring this case, because if we bring this case, there will be an opportunity for others to say that there is Hong Kong's dirty linen, there are the stained sheets. You see, it is not autonomous after all, and I think that's been going around. And finally, this idea that we have a choice, that there is a great amount of latitude, there is a great amount of discretion involved. The first myth, discrimination, on how difficult it might be to argue discrimination. It goes something like this, and it's been in the press, it's been in the South China Morning Post. How can we argue that we are discriminated against by being treated as a part of China? And when that point is put across, those who would put this point across latch on to a particular form of words found in certain provisions, for example, in Article 9 of the GATT, where there is this phrase, treatment no less favorable than. Well, they say, how can you receive unfavorable treatment by being treated as a part of China? How can that be an unfavorable comparison? Now, in terms of mythology, this one is Loki, the deceiver, the shapeshifter, because here the true comparison lies in the fact that all WTO members get to mark their goods as their own. And with this measure, following from President Trump's executive order on Hong Kong normalization, what the United States is saying is that Hong Kong doesn't get to mark its goods as its own. So that is where the discrimination lies. Everyone gets to mark their goods as their own. Hong Kong doesn't get to do so. The sorts of provisions that we might be looking at are Article 1, Paragraph 1 of the GATT. That is the general non-discrimination rule. There is also Article 9.1 of the GATT, which I've already mentioned. You don't discriminate against a WTO member in respect of marks of origin. There are other agreements, such as the Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement. You don't discriminate in the imposition of technical regulations. And in the annex of the TPT agreement, marking and labeling regulations are considered technical regulations. So these are the sorts of provisions. This is a sampling of the provisions that we would be looking at if a case were ever to be brought, and if the argument were to be made, as I think it should be made in such a case, that Hong Kong is being discriminated against. That is the core of the case. This is a discriminatory measure. A WTO member is being discriminated against. There is no issue about anyone saying that a comparison with the People's Republic of China is unfavorable. And that is why we could never mount that argument with a straight face. We can. The second myth has to do with, actually I've never seen this before. I've never seen a newspaper report cite a detailed provision of a trade agreement. And in the press, it has been said that really what it comes down to is this provision called Article 26(5)(c) of the GATT. And that provision says, if you acquire autonomy, you can then be sponsored to become a contracting party to the GATT. And we've heard Tony tell us all about the history of that provision. No doubt Stuart was involved in those days. But all of that happened in 1986. Hong Kong was sponsored and became a GATT contracting party. What happened next, as Tony mentioned, was that it took 8 years of negotiations, the Uruguay round negotiations, before we got to 1994. We got to another agreement called the Marrakesh Agreement, and we saw the establishment of the WTO. In Article 11 of the Marrakesh Agreement, it is said that if you are a GATT contracting party at the time, in 1994, you will become an original, a founding member of the World Trade Organization. And that is what the Hong Kong SAR today is, a founding member of the World Trade Organization. It wasn't until 7 years later that China became a WTO member. So that is something worth remembering. The governing clause is not a GATT provision. The governing clause here is the Marrakesh Agreement. What is happening with this American measure reminds me of what the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, Mr. Trump's Council of Economic Advisors,
Mr. Kudlow.
threatened in a BBC interview in November 2018. And he said, this was the greatest empty threat. China itself should be evicted from the World Trade Organization. There are no provisions for evicting or expelling anybody. A WTO member can withdraw, but there are at least no express provisions on expelling a member. However, if we look at this executive order, this latest executive order on Hong Kong normalization, it tries to do something very similar, not with China, but with the Hong Kong SAR. What the executive order tries to do is to treat Hong Kong as if it isn't a WTO member. Now, I'm not saying that if there is a case in Geneva that we should argue it that way, rather than to argue a technical case, but that essentially is what is happening. So it's very important to be clear that the governing clause in relation to Hong Kong's status is not the GATT, it is the Marrakesh Agreement. And we are talking about treating a WTO member as if it were no longer a part of that Organization. So that's the second myth, that the governing clause in relation to Hong Kong status is a gap provision. The third myth is that this has nothing to do with where goods come from. I'm just going to read, if I may, CBP's statement on this, US CBP statement on this. The change in marking requirements does not affect country of origin determinations. For purposes of assessing ordinary duties under Chapters 1 to 97 of the Harmonized Tariff Schedule of the United States, or temporary or additional duties under Chapter 99 of the Harmonized Tariff Schedule of the United States. Therefore, goods that are products of Hong Kong should continue to report International Organization for Standardization ISO Country Code HK as the country of origin when required. Now, when you decipher all of that, what it suggests is that it is business as usual. We're just asking you to label Hong Kong goods as goods that are made in China. We're not saying that they don't come from Hong Kong. There is no question of differential duties or a change in duties that are imposed by the United States. There are no additional duties. There are no punitive duties such as those which are being applied to products from China. There is no question about treating Hong Kong goods as goods that come from another WTO member. Now, I've put it in such a deliberate way because it suggests that a legal mind has been hard at work. We're going to hit Hong Kong, but we're going to calibrate this so precisely that really no one can complain, and more importantly, we might even try to take it out from under the sheltering scope of something called the Rules of Origin Agreement. Because this has nothing to do with rules of origin. This has nothing to do with where goods come from. So what we know is that if a case is brought, this is going to be the position of the United States. Any argument that this does have something to do with where goods come from will be resisted by the United States. So we have some work to do, but on this point, I'm fairly confident what a Hong Kong argument will look like. I'll simply say here that it is a myth that this has nothing to do with where goods come from. Let me get to the fourth myth, because I think this is the most important one, and it's been said in the press and it's caught attention. We shouldn't bring this case, a number of people said. It would lead to washing Hong Kong's dirty linen in public. You have to decipher that as well. What does it mean to say that dirty linen will be washed? The suggestion, I suppose, is that it may be shown that Hong Kong is not as autonomous as it says. Let's think about that. If we, turning away from the WTO agreements, if we were to take a look at the basic law of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region, in Chapter 4, in Article 43, it states quite clearly that the Chief Executive, as the head of the Hong Kong SAR, is accountable to the Central People's Government. That is written, plain as day, as well as being accountable to the Hong Kong SAR. That does not undermine Hong Kong's autonomy. And most importantly, that provision in Chapter 4 is quite separate from two other provisions in Chapters 5 and 7 of the Basic Law. In Chapter 5, which deals with the economy, Article 116 says that the Hong Kong SAR shall be, and I emphasize the word shall because I'll come back to it, shall be a separate customs territory. And in Chapter 7, separately, in Article 151, it states that the Hong Kong SAR may, using the name Hong Kong China, maintain and develop relations, conduct and implement agreements with foreign states, regions, and international organizations. The word there is may in Article 151. But in Article 116, it states that the Hong Kong SAR shall be a separate customs territory. So, being a separate customs territory has nothing to do with the fact that the Hong Kong SAR's chief executive is still accountable to the Central People's Government. The 2 points are entirely separate. In any case, if anyone wants to make an issue of this, they do not need a WTO case to pursue this point. Let us think about the WTO more closely. In the WTO members talk to each other all the time. That's how they do business. The Hong Kong SAR talking to the People's Republic of China is no different. How is business done in the WTO? Through informal groupings. In the golden age of the Uruguay round, there was the Beau Rivage group, named after the hotel. These were small, developing and developed nations which met to discuss common issues. Hong Kong was part of another informal grouping called the BIC group. There was the Cairns group, dealing with agricultural issues. There were the West African Cotton Four. There were the Friends of Fish, dealing with fishery subsidies. There were the Friends of Geographical Indications. There were the Friends of the Development Box. There was my favorite, the Invisibles group, senior officials in the capitals you don't see on the ground. There was the Like-Minded group. There was the Paradisus group. Countries and customs territories talked to each other and still talk to each other all the time. How can it possibly be suggested that the Hong Kong SAR as a WTO member cannot talk to China as another WTO member? So I don't put much stock in this business about Hong Kong risking dirty linen being washed in public. I think it's a mischievous point. It repeats the allegation that somehow Hong Kong is not autonomous. Finally, I get to the 5th point, and there's this huge debate about whether Hong Kong should or should not bring a case. We all assume that it's a matter of choice and we just have to figure out what the best way forward is. But if it is stated in the Basic Law that Hong Kong shall be a customs territory in Article 116, and you have other provisions in the Basic Law, such as Article 104, where you have to uphold the Basic Law, where the government of the day has to uphold the Basic Law, then it may be that there is some kind of a duty involved. And if there is, then that needs to be considered, and it has to be considered as well how that duty can be fulfilled. What we have in the press at the moment is this question that has been put forward. Why did it take the Hong Kong government 1 month to write a letter to be delivered to the United States mission in Geneva, and for the ETO in DC to deliver the same letter, when we all know that consultations outside the filing of a request for consultations does nothing? Now, it may be normal diplomatic practice, but it is no substitute for filing a request for consultations. But maybe we're not ready to file a request for consultations. Well, perhaps, but let us not misunderstand the dispute settlement system. The main aim of the dispute settlement system is not to force the parties into an angry dispute. The main aim of the dispute settlement system is for the parties themselves to achieve a mutually agreed solution. So negotiations and consultations comprise the principle, the main aim of WTO dispute settlement. Filing a request for consultations means exactly how it sounds. So Article 3.7 of the dispute settlement understanding states that the objective is to achieve a mutually acceptable solution. Provisions like Article 5.1 of the dispute settlement understanding allow the parties to enter into negotiations anywhere along the entire process. And the process looks something like this. You file a request for consultations. In this case, the United States would have 10 days to reply. Within a period of 30 days, consultations must begin. If after 60 days nothing happens, coming out of those discussions, then the Hong Kong SAR may request the establishment of a panel. It doesn't say that the Hong Kong SAR must. So it puzzles me a little bit why we haven't filed a request. It is perfectly harmless. So instead we are looking with side curved head, curious what will come next, both in and out of the game, and watching and wondering. The SAR shall be a separate customs territory. A letter is no substitute for a request, and I think on that note, I'd better stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Lim. I re-echo the fifth myth you mentioned, that external negotiation outside the WTO context doesn't stop a member from filing a request for consultation, and that has just been reaffirmed in the independent report published on the 15th of September this year with respect to China's complaint against US imposing the tariffs. I'll definitely come back to Professor Lim on the third myth with respect to the possible defenses raised by the US government and how the Hong Kong government is going to rebut those arguments. But before I go back to Professor Lim, let's invite our last speaker, Mr. Harbinson. Mr. Harbinson will definitely discuss with the WTO issue in broader context, the US-Hong Kong trade relations, and of course, in his personal experience, he's going to share his personal experience in representing Hong Kong in the WTO. I'm sure that Mr. Harbinson will share his experience in joining those informal groupings that Professor Lim talked about. Mr. Harbinson.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Adrian, for inviting me to take part in this very, very interesting discussion. And of course, thank you very much also to the Asian Academy of International Law for putting on the event. I listened with raptly to the tremendous presentations that we heard from Dr. Neo and Professor Lim, and I'm wondering what I can add to that. I'm going to try to, however, touch on maybe 6 areas very briefly. I would like to say something a little bit about the general nature of trade relations between Hong Kong and the US. A little bit more about Hong Kong in the WTO. I think quite a lot has been said about that, particularly by Dr. Neo already, but I can perhaps add a little bit to that. Talk a little bit then about Hong Kong and dispute settlement in the WTO, and also a little bit about the general picture on WTO dispute settlement at this point in time, before I turn to the recent US action regarding Hong Kong. And finally, a little question that I'd like to pose at the end is, are there any lessons for Hong Kong in this episode, or saga? I won't go on at length on that, but I'd like to at least raise the issue. So turning first to the relationship, the trade relationship between the US and Hong Kong, I think anyone would have to say that generally the relationship over the years and the decades has been very good. We've had a few ups and downs with the US in areas historically like textile quotas, which Tony Neo mentioned. But on the whole, I think the US has always seen Hong Kong as a positive force for the cause of progressive trade liberalization. And indeed, in as recently 2018, when Hong Kong had underwent its last trade policy review in the WTO, which all members have to do from time to time, the US specifically commended Hong Kong for its commitment over the years to an open and free market economy. And I'd have to note also that although I don't have figures for the most recent year to hand, I think the current administration in the US would certainly register the fact that the US's largest surplus in trade in goods globally is with Hong Kong. And we know that the current administration in the US sets quite a lot of store by trade balances. The current dispute is therefore a bit perplexing because Hong Kong's trade policy now is essentially the same as it always has been. And obviously, to anybody in the area, in the region, it remains clearly distinct and different from China's trade policy. This, to me, is a simple statement of fact because the respective trade policies of the Hong Kong SAR and China clearly reflect the different nature of the economies and how they choose to make a living in the world. One could almost paraphrase Mike Pompeo, in my view, and say that no reasonable person could assert today that there is no difference between Hong Kong's trade policy and China's trade policy. The WTO is indeed unusual among international organizations in that it allows for the full membership not only of states, but also of separate customs territories. And I should underline perhaps that no difference whatsoever is made between states and separate customs territories in terms of their rights and obligations under the WTO. The WTO's budget is based on members' share of global trade. Hong Kong is the 9th largest contributor to the WTO budget out of 164 members. That's more than, for example, India or Italy or Singapore. So it's not as if Hong Kong is insignificant in the WTO. As Tony Neo said, Hong Kong became a GATT contracting party in 1986, in April 1986, actually. At that time, China circulated a communication to the GATT contracting parties, stating that it had decided to resume sovereignty over Hong Kong on the 1st of July 1997. After that date, Hong Kong would retain the status of a separate customs territory and would continue to decide its economic and trade policy on its own. Using the name, quote, Hong Kong, China, unquote, it could maintain and develop relations and conclude and implement agreements with states, regions, and relevant international organizations in the economic, trade, and other fields. Subsequently, as has also been alluded to, Hong Kong was a full and indeed very active participant in the Uruguay round of multilateral trade negotiations between 1986 and 1994. This included many negotiations with the United States across the board of potential WTO subjects. The Uruguay round gave birth to the World Trade Organization on the 1st of January 1995, with Hong Kong as one of the founding 123 members of the organization. So I agree very much with Professor Lim in saying that the route that Hong Kong found into the GATT in 1996 under Article 26(5)(c) is now defunct. You cannot join the GATT these days. You have to join the WTO, and there's a separate path for doing that. And there's no way that you can be expelled from the WTO. You can withdraw if you want, but you can't be expelled. Since 1997, Hong Kong, or Hong Kong China to use the official name, has continued to be very active in the WTO. It's contributed constructively to virtually all the trade liberalizing initiatives that have taken place, from telecoms to the Information Technology Agreement, to talks on environmental goods, trade in services, and digital trade. It also played a not insignificant part in the launch of the, alas, ill-fated Doha round. If you just excuse me a minute, I'm going to sorry about that. I think I've been talking too much this morning. I rehearse all of these facts and history to demonstrate that Hong Kong is more than a mere appendage to the WTO, or is somehow a second-class member. It's true that in terms of dispute settlement, Hong Kong has perhaps been somewhat less active. Hong Kong has only instigated one case against another member, and that was against Turkey over textiles and clothing quotas. In this, it was essentially a co-complainant with India. I can go into detail if anyone is interested, but the result, which was in 1999, was that Turkey was found to be in breach of WTO rules. There are many possible explanations as to why Hong Kong has not been a complainant more frequently. Either it has not felt that it has been clearly and specifically discriminated against, or members have initiated, or other members have initiated cases covering Hong Kong's concerns, or maybe the issues involved long-standing ambiguities in WTO rules, of which we know there are many, or maybe they have been satisfactorily dealt with in bilateral talks without the need for formal WTO dispute settlement. Hong Kong has, however, been involved in many cases as a third party. In all, to date, 22, which is a respectable number. Third parties can and do make submissions and are invited to speak at meetings. These cases have involved matters relating to anti-dumping and information technology, and more recently, the Trump tariffs. Hong Kong has never been a respondent in a WTO dispute. This, I think, reflects the great care that the SAR government takes to abide by its WTO obligations, and indeed its high reputation in the international trading community in this respect. WTO disputes may have been relatively few for Hong Kong, But of course, many WTO members, particularly developing country members, have not participated at all, or only minimally at best. More widely, however, dispute settlement has been a very active area for the WTO. And this must, at least in part, reflect the fact that governments have found it useful and have confidence in it. One of the great things about WTO dispute settlement is that it de-dramatizes disputes. It takes trade issues which may have become politically hot, either domestically or internationally, and reduces them to technical or legal issues. The time taken to hear cases, while sometimes frustrating, also means that there's a cooling off period during which the parties can reflect. There have been very nearly 600 cases in the 25 years since the WTO was established. That's an average of 24 a year, or in fact, 2 new cases every month. So dispute settlement in the WTO is routine. As you know, the appellate body became non-operational at the end of last year due to the US's refusal to make appointments. We'll have to see how this pans out over time. Many members have some sympathy with the US's complaints about the appellate body, although they would probably disagree with its methods. There is still a lot of focus on the issue in Geneva, and encouragingly, all of the candidates to take over as the new Director General of the WTO regard settling the appellate body issue as the top priority. In the meantime, the panel stage of the dispute settlement process remains intact. The panel stage takes a considerable time. For example, if a member wanted to initiate a dispute now, it would have to go through the consultation stage, then get a panel established by the dispute settlement body. Then the appointments to the panel would have to be made before the panel could even start its work. Probably the earliest we would see a panel report would be in the first half of 2022. It's fun to speculate, but it's impossible to say what the situation with respect to the appellate body will be by then. My own conclusion is that the current non-operation of the appellate body is not a good reason for a member not to proceed with a dispute now. I'll turn now to some of the specifics of the recent action by the US on the marking of Hong Kong products as made in China. As far as I know, the US allows other WTO members to mark their products as having been made within their customs territories. Such is indeed the normal commercial practice. The US has a general obligation to treat Hong Kong in the same way under the MFN principle. Requiring Hong Kong alone to mark its products as having been made in another customs territory is on its face, in my view, discriminatory. To me, it's a blatant violation of some of the legal provisions which Professor Lim has already mentioned, Articles 1 and 9 of the GATT in particular, and possibly the TBT agreement as well. It does not matter that the level of trade involved may not be very large. There could even be no current trade. It would make no difference. In the WTO's eyes, discrimination is discrimination. The issue, in my view, goes directly to whether or not is a separate customs territory, which for Hong Kong is a very serious matter, on which the basic law is very clear, and which is also the basis for its WTO membership. Other WTO members will be watching closely to see how Hong Kong responds. They would expect it to take some form of action. If it doesn't, they may conclude that Hong Kong does not feel strongly about whether it's treated as a separate customs territory or not. That will condition their future attitudes and actions towards Hong Kong. There is a lot of talk in the media and elsewhere about Hong Kong becoming, quote, just another Chinese city, unquote. Well, in at least one respect, it currently isn't, because it has this distinct profile in international trade as a separate customs territory. How would the US react to being challenged in the WTO? Some think that in doing so, Hong Kong would be asking for more trouble. And it's true, let's face it, especially under the current US administration, that there are more trade actions that the US could take against Hong Kong if it wanted to do so. Surprisingly, the US has been a respondent in 155 WTO dispute cases, quite a large number. However, this is hugely skewed by many cases, over 100 in fact, involving trade remedies like anti-dumping and countervailing duties. The US feels very strongly that it has been unjustly treated in this area, and this is indeed its main motivation for closing down the appellate body. But the Hong Kong product marking issue is completely different. The US seems to me to have given Hong Kong a bit of a prod with a stick. It could have gone further, for example, by making Hong Kong pay the additional tariffs on Chinese products, but it didn't. It wants to see how Hong Kong reacts and whether it takes its status as a separate customs territory seriously. Looked at in a slightly different way, it may be a wake-up call for Hong Kong from the US. If you still want to be treated as separate from China in the trade sense, you better get your act together. I feel, based on my experience, that the US will not want to deny Hong Kong due process before a panel. The US has not backed away from panels as it has from the appellate body, and it is attached, as we all know, to due process. I may be wrong. Perhaps the US will refuse to engage in consultations with Hong Kong. If it did come to that, it could be an indication that indeed the US no longer wants to regard Hong Kong as a WTO member from now on. But that would be a huge step to take and a very sudden escalation with serious implications for US business. I fervently hope that it won't happen, and I don't think it will, given the very long-standing positive commercial relationship. I also don't think that other WTO members would agree with the US if it did that. Nor, in any case, would it necessarily prevent Hong Kong from going to a panel, because one of the lessons from the case against Turkey on textiles is that a refusal to consult with another person or another member of the WTO that requests consultations cannot mean that the route to a panel is blocked off. In my view, the sensible thing to do for both sides, if they can't find an immediate solution through bilateral talks, is to proceed serenely to a panel in a measured and calm way and let the lawyers sort it out in the fullness of time. On the Hong Kong side, I just don't see that it has any choice in the light of the history, its status in the WTO, and the relevant provisions of the Basic Law. Not challenging the US would seem to indicate that Hong Kong acquiesces in not exercising its autonomy in conducting its external commercial relations. Finally, are there any lessons for Hong Kong in this sorry saga? Yes and no. No, perhaps because Hong Kong is in the unfortunate position of being caught in the middle of a trade and geo-economic war. It can do very little or nothing really to influence the outcome of that. But yes, maybe, in the sense that it may need to adjust to the new reality that its place in the international trading system can no longer be taken for granted. Reciting the old mantra about free trade and an open economy may no longer be sufficient. Hong Kong trade policy is coming under increased scrutiny. We can see that from the way the US has behaved. So Hong Kong may need to up its game to prove that its high degree of autonomy in trade remains intact, and that it still highly values bilateral commercial relations with trading partners around the world. This may require rethinking some policies in the WTO and elsewhere. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harbinson. So before I invite the members of the audience to send their Q&A to us, of course, you feel free to do so, members of the audience. I do have some questions. Mr. Harbinson, you mentioned twice in your presentation about the consultation request with Turkey. My understanding is that that was the first attempt and probably the last attempt as well of Hong Kong as a separate member of that time is GATT to request consultation with Turkey back in 1996. My understanding is that the consultation did not proceed at the end of the day because of Turkey's insisting the EC, the European Community, joining as a party rather than as a third party. So any lesson we can learn from this experience if Hong Kong this time is minded to seek consultation with the US government?
Thanks very much. Very interesting question. This was actually in the very early days of the WTO. I think 1996. And at that time, Turkey had just formed a customs union with the European communities. The European communities had quotas on textiles and clothing products. And so Turkey said that in joining a customs union, it had no option but also to introduce quotas on textiles and clothing products, the same as the EU. Both Hong Kong and India actually took issue with this course of action, and they both independently, but very much around the same time, requested consultations with Turkey. Turkey replied to both Hong Kong and India that it would not enter into consultations because it could only consult if the European communities was also in the room as a co-respondent, as it were, in the case, because the quotas originated from the European communities. Hong Kong and India didn't accept that. The action had clearly been taken by Turkey. Turkey was a separate WTO member, and so it had to answer for what it had done. So following quite deep consultations between Hong Kong and India, it was agreed that India would proceed with the case and Hong Kong would back it up and coordinate it with it and be a third party in the case. So India went ahead to the dispute settlement body and requested the establishment of a panel. The panel was established, notwithstanding Turkey's objections. And indeed, one of the things the panel did was to consider the procedural argument that Turkey had raised about the requirement for the European communities to be a co-respondent. And the panel rejected that argument. And the panel also found that Turkey had infringed its WTO obligations. So this was a clear win. This case was a clear win for India and Hong Kong. I put it that way. Of course, India was, if you look it up on the WTO website, India is the complainant, but you can take it from my personal experience and involvement at the time that, in fact, we were very, very much alongside India, feeding stuff into them, advising them, and we essentially were acting as co-complainants.
Thank you, Mr. Harbinson, for sharing your personal experience with that on that occasion. So, a very important question tonight's issue about Hong Kong government about to make use of the WTO procedures against the U.S. government for the new measures. Some comments suggest that the Hong Kong government is kicking the hornet's nest, but some say that we should fight as a matter of principle. I understand that the speakers have briefly touched upon this issue, but I want you to state your view. Is there a middle ground, or not just your view on that? Tony?
I think Hong Kong has joined the WTO as Hong Kong, China, as I understand it, not just Hong Kong. So one way to deal with the labeling, actually, is to just label it Hong Kong, China. And that that of course establishes our position as a member of the WTO and as a separate customs territory. And at the same time, of course, there's the middle ground in there. I understand that a number of chambers of commerce are in fact going for that. Now, whether or not at the end of the day that would be the compromise, I don't know. But I think one of the things that we have to look at in this saga is that if you look at the executive order, I mean, I quite agree with what Chin said, is that there's very careful calibration behind this, in fact. If you look at the order itself, it essentially deals with a few things. First of all, it veers away from what I would consider to be sort of political issues, essentially like suspending the rendition agreements, the agreements on transfer of sentenced persons, and so on and so forth. The determination that Hong Kong is no longer autonomous, as it were, by the president, is essentially a political decision, not based on Hong Kong's autonomy as a trade, or in fact as an entity which is allowed to enter into international relations through the name of Hong Kong, China. And the most important thing, as I've said when I stopped, was that if you look at the agreements which are still extant, like the air traffic agreement, for example, is very much there. And therefore, one can probably see that there are more aspects of common interests and common economic, I think, gain for both sides than, in fact, the disagreement which is in there. And as Stuart quite rightly said, let us not bring ourselves into an angry argument. I think let us try to deal with this in a measured way. My own view is that bringing this to dispute resolution not necessarily bad, because we don't have the appellate body anymore for the time being anyway. There's consultations. And I think the SAR government has taken the first step by writing a letter And I haven't seen the letter, so I don't know whether in fact this is a letter which requests consultation, in fact a letter which asks for an opportunity to discuss things. But at least you could actually start with that. But I think one should look at this as careful calibration, because I think those in the White House, particularly the people who are advising the president on economics and trade, they are quite careful not to ensure that they bring down the whole house. I mean, they would want to deal with this in a way which assists the president in terms of his political agenda. And there's some unfriendly things in there which clearly assist his political agenda. But it doesn't sort of really kick us that badly in terms of trade at the moment. But I think we should defend our position. I think we otherwise, I think, as Stuart quite rightly say, it may be seen to that we have waived our position, and that would not be a good thing.
Professor Lim?
Yeah, I think I've shown my hand on this one. I think the problem with writing a letter and having consultations outside the formal consultation process, which the dispute settlement understanding provides for, is that there is no time limit. There is no
You don't
clear
start,
end
you just don't
to the
start the
process.
clock.
Correct.
Yeah.
Whereas the way the DSU is written, it forces you to focus on the issue. And in 10 days, you have to reply, and within 30 days, you need to actually start talking. And you've got 60 days of talking to do before anyone can do anything drastic. It focuses the mind. And so to me, that is a middle way. You don't have to go all the way to a panel, but the fact that the clock is ticking means that everyone needs to focus on the issue.
Mr. Harbinson?
Thanks very much, Adrian. Yeah. Well, on this hornet's nest argument, I really think that defending your basic rights in an institution of which you're a member can hardly be described as kicking a hornet's nest. We can't just roll over. It's a direct challenge. And I think it's a test, as I said. I think both Tony and Chin have very accurately said that there's a carefully calibrated action so far. You can look at that two ways. That they didn't want to go too far is one way of looking at it, and that might be partly true. But on the other hand, are they testing Hong Kong to see what it'll do? And if it does nothing, well, they may feel it's very easy to go further next time.
I think the other thing might be this, that as I think we all agree that this is actually carefully calibrated. The other aspect of that is that the U.S. in fact not only has a great amount of trade with Hong Kong, and through Hong Kong, in fact, into China. I mean, in the Phase 1 agreement with China, in fact, there's a lot of provisions in terms of market access into China for financial institutions, for protection of intellectual property rights, and so on. In fact, at the end of the day, that requires Hong Kong actually to be part of that process. In fact, there's a lot of the enforcement is not just within Shanghai or Shenzhen and so on, because this percolates around the whole area. So therefore, our judicial arrangements and enforcement and so on are issues which require, in fact, Hong Kong to be part and parcel of. And the other thing, of course, is the financial system. That if, for example, any international financial institution wishes to actually have greater market access within China, it must have, in fact, some kind of address, not only address, but some kind of presence in Hong Kong, as in fact the international market, which actually acts as the bridge between international currencies and the renminbi. So therefore, really, Hong Kong, as I completely agree with what Stuart says, is to stand up with itself and get its act together in ensuring that what we do comply with the best practices in fact, internationally. And this is what we have been doing all the time. I think not only in trade, but also in finance, in law, in any professional field that what one could think of.
Thank you. I think I have to be fair to the virtual floor as well. Let me pick a question from the floor. So I've got a question. Apart from origin marking, are there any other areas where the US is no longer giving preferential treatment? And how can this be reconciled as being to the extent permitted by law according to the US executive order? So in gist, what is coming if Hong Kong just let it go? So, anyone who's coming first?
Well, the executive order, in fact, directs the various governments of the various institutions of the federal government to provide to the White House within 15 days any rule changes and any particular kind of actions that they propose to take. So far, the 15 days is gone, and we have seen what we have today. So there's nothing more at this stage. But as Stuart says, we can't be sure that there isn't at this stage. So we just have to wait and see.
I just want to clarify one thing. It's not preferential treatment. It's most favored nation treatment, and the United States is bound by law to grant it. So far, this is just the first step. Stuart may be right. They're testing our fences, but it's also a first breach in our eyes.
Mr. Harbinson, any supplement?
Just very briefly, I agree very much with the other two panelists on this issue, and Professor Lim is absolutely right. We should get away from talking about preferential treatment all the time, because this is an obligation that the US has towards Hong Kong. But there are forms of preferential treatment that have been changed in various ways. For example, the US operates a system of export licenses for certain types of technology product. And they and many Western countries have been doing this for decades. Hong Kong used to be able to receive those licenses, and I gather that has now come under question. But this is a completely separate matter from the origin, marking requirement. But that is preferential treatment, because it is permissible under WTO rules for them to issue export licenses for these types of products.
Thank you. The next question, I promise I come back to Professor Lim. You mentioned in your third myth about the potential defenses that the US government is going to raise if we fail to resolve the dispute in the consultation stage and someone decides to take the matter to the panel stage. So what are the possible arguments that the Hong Kong government can do to rebut the defenses without showing too many cards on the table now?
I wouldn't have thought it so easy to separate marking and labeling from the regulation of rules of origin.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. The next question I have is recently, just probably 2 weeks ago, on the 15th of September, that the panel has just issued a report with respect to China's complaint against the US for imposition of the tariffs. And it held that the panel found that there was no sufficient connection between the measures of tariffs imposed by the US government and on one hand, and the so-called public morals that they claimed they seek to achieve. So any lessons or any implications from that decision with respect to our current potential intended complaint by the Hong Kong government? So
I haven't read it yet.
Okay. This Section 301 case arises from punitive tariffs applied against China in 2018 primarily, but also in relation to certain tariffs that were implemented in 2019. This is not the only case that China has brought, because there have been several tranches of tariffs, punitive tariffs. In an ideal world, by losing before this panel, all the tariffs will be removed, but we know that is not going to happen. The interesting thing is that the case ran alongside what is described in the press as the trade deal between the United States and China. And I mention that because the trade deal has its own dispute settlement mechanism, comprising discussions between officials, something called a bilateral evaluation and dispute resolution office that is set up on both sides, stateside and in China. And for larger matters, this is dealt with by a trade framework group. The whole idea of the trade deal is to take matters out of the WTO, in my view. And yet the Section 301 case ran alongside it. There was no retaliation. And it suggests to me that the idea that if Hong Kong were to bring a case, it would result in some very violent reaction by the United States may be overplayed. That's what I'm drawing from this, but of course, they are two separate WTO members.
Mr. Harbinson?
Yes, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think that this case on U.S. tariff measures against China is completely separate from the Hong Kong marking case. Of course, there's no connection. But I noticed that USTR blasted the panel ruling. Another example of WTO rules being inadequate to deal with China and requiring reform, he said, words to that effect. So I think perhaps the downside from a systemic point of view, and perhaps marginally from a Hong Kong point of view, is this, this indicates that the USTR has still very much got WTO dispute settlement in its sights and is not happy with it. As to what will happen, well, I think within 60 days of the report, I believe, either the dispute settlement body would adopt it, or somebody would appeal it. And I imagine the US would appeal it, which essentially sends this into a legal void, since there is no appellate body at present.
Yes, while we are on this decision, one of the procedural arguments raised by the US in this China's complaint is that there was already ongoing negotiation outside the context of the WTO, and that constitutes a settlement, and hence is sort of outside the jurisdiction of the WTO, so to speak. And the panel rejected this allegation. So now we have the Hong Kong government writing a letter to the US government requesting discussion, bilateral negotiation. So would that give rise to a platform for the US government to reiterate this argument? And how would the panel react to this argument if that goes to the panel?
Well, this sort of tactic, in fact, is not well looked upon by international tribunals. In fact, because you're trying to raise an estoppel in this case, and estoppels are never liked by tribunals. And in fact, it has to be so clear that it sort of dispars parties from their remedies. So I don't think that this argument would run very well with any tribunal. But I think what this does, though, is to provide some guidance to the parties as to where things stand in terms of the rules. Whatever you know, as Stuart quite rightly says, if the US appeals it, it gets sent into a legal void. So what's the point? But then there is argumentation in here, which somehow helps the dialogue. And I think both sides, when they meet and they deal with, in fact, phase one, and I don't know whether phase two would come along, maybe, I don't know. Some of this is what I call jurisprudence, might be helpful. But and I think each side would pick the bits in there which helps their case.
Yes.
As lawyers often do.
I think the clause that was mentioned and the clause that the United States relied on is the clause that says, if you have a settlement, then the panel will just record it. It's common practice, such as the practice before an arbitration tribunal. I think you may have a point, Adrian, that if I were the United States, I would run the argument, but I don't think it will be a successful argument. I agree with Tony, because it could simply be said that this falls under DSU Article 5.1. You are allowed to continue discussions alongside panel proceedings. The real problem with this letter is that you have a witness in the box who's feigning anger, and the SCMP has remarked upon how strong some of the statements from government have been, but at the same time, that witness is smiling from ear to ear. So it's not a very compelling witness. That's the dissonance in this picture. I think that's all.
There's also probably a groundswell of what I would call fundamentalist feelings. In fact, around many countries, we see that, for example, with the protests, which started with the Uruguay rounds. You know, every time there is a WTO meeting, there's sundry people from all kinds of factions coming out and demonstrating, and that somehow pushes politicians into the way that they react. And certainly, President Trump is a prime example. Now, whether in fact Joe Biden, if he gets elected, will actually change this is difficult to tell, because I think the groundswell of fundamentalist feelings is very strong in terms of trade. I mean, particularly creation of jobs and so on. So he may not change that much, but I think he might be more measured. Members of his team have been traveling from time to time, and one of them is actually a Harvard friend of mine. And I asked him, how would President Biden, if he gets elected, react to China? And he gives me a smile and says he will be very strategic. Now, what on earth does that mean? I don't know, actually. but I think he will get into the flow of the politics, and the politics at the moment is highly fundamentalist. I think it'd be very hard for him to get away from it.
Mr. Harbinson?
Well, in terms of the current Hong Kong-US dispute over the marking issues, I think, as Professor Lim said earlier, there's an element of normal diplomatic discourse going on here. If you have a very good and long-standing and positive trading relationship with another economy, and then you run into a problem like this, you don't immediately go to the WTO. If you have respect for the other party, and obviously Hong Kong has got respect for the US, you say, I've got a complaint, let's discuss it outside the WTO. And then if you can't resolve it, then Hong Kong would simply say, well, we haven't resolved it. I'm sorry. That's the end of this conversation. We'll take it up in the WTO. So I think this is the way to go about things. I think it's perfectly correct. It takes a bit more time, but then, I don't think we need to be in a huge rush about this. There's no guillotine in terms of the time before you can take a panel. it's completely open-ended. I don't, on the other hand, suggest that Hong Kong should and the US should just drag on and talk bilaterally for forever and ever. I mean, there can be a conversation, but it should become pretty clear quite quickly whether it's going anywhere. And then if it's not going anywhere, then Hong Kong needs to bring it to an end.
Thank you. So my last question is that some suggest that what US is doing has called into question the continued existence of Hong Kong as a separate customs and international trading hub. Do you agree? So what can be done to fortify the status of Hong Kong as an international trade city?
I think compliance and respect for the rules and standing up for them, and then be professional about this. I think that has always been the hallmark of Hong Kong, and if we continue to do that, I can't see that people can. Well, as Stuart quite rightly, you can't kick people out of the WTO, and we certainly won't be kicked out, and we certainly will not withdraw. We just carry on life as usual and be as professional as possible. But I don't know what Chin thinks.
No, I think due to years of efforts on the part of, I wanted to say people like Stuart, but really on Stuart's part, we have a good reputation. And we are trusted, often as an intermediary. We can take the lead on some issues, and where we can, I think we should, in the sphere of economic diplomacy more broadly. So I think this is, as Stuart pointed out, maybe a little bit of a wake-up call. Maybe if we haven't been showing people that we are a separate customs territory, and a serious player, that people might forget.
I would remind people that in fact we have free trade agreements with many countries. I mean, for example, we have a free trade agreement with the EU.
Yes.
And one with Chile, New Zealand, Georgia, ASEAN.
ASEAN, yes.
And Australia. And of course, the important one is CEPA. So in terms of trade with our major partners, we are there in terms of free trade agreements. And obviously, these agreements have been there for some time. We've been operating them. The other thing which is interesting is technology. Because part of although the Doha round didn't come out with a lot of things, one thing which came out of that was the trade facilitation agreement. And the trade facilitation agreement is very, very important in terms of the application of technology in the future. Because, in due course of these new things like blockchain and so on, trade facilitation really requires a lot of technology, and it could actually be dovetailed with financing, with trade financing. So I think, again, though this would be one of the areas of common interest among many countries, with banks getting involved in that, with customs requiring, in fact, trade facilitation systems to be good and not to be tampered with. And of course, and anti-money laundering as well coming into this. So we do have a lot more in common than we have to argue about. Because without these systems, in fact, world trade cannot continue.
Mr. Harbinson?
Yeah, I'll recount a little story. A couple of months ago, I had a very informal meeting with a senior US trade policy official, who I didn't know very well, but he is quite senior. And in the course of the conversation, he said, "What's the difference between Hong Kong's trade policy and China's trade policy?" Well, I was flabbergasted, actually. I mean, I just, for a minute, I just, this was a knowledgeable person. And he actually knew a little bit about Hong Kong. In fact, he'd been to Hong Kong some years ago. So I went through it, and I explained Hong Kong zero tariffs, zero quotas, and all this stuff. And he nodded his head. Later, I kind of reflected on the conversation, and I thought really there was a message in the question that maybe some other WTO members have got this question in their mind. What really is the difference between Hong Kong trade policy and China's trade policy? I mean, on the surface, it's obvious, but are there things under the surface that they're not articulating, but they're kind of vaguely aware of, that are giving them questions? I really don't know. I really don't know. I think this US action is certainly the first signs of them questioning openly Hong Kong's status as a separate customs territory. And my point in my talk was that I think we need to be aware of this, and Hong Kong maybe needs to not rest on its laurels and develop some more convincing narratives as to its vision of its future position in the world of international trade.
Looking at your position from Geneva, Stuart, I mean, one of the things that I have noticed really in recent times, in the last 1 or 2 years, in fact, is that the channels of communication, in fact, were not as good as before. Whereas before it's very easy to pick up a phone, you ring up somebody from the USTR, or you have a lawyer who's previously a member of USTR, and this sort of conversation and informal chat seems to be quite smooth. And in recent years, this has somehow not been the case, and I don't know how one can deal with this. The other thing, of course, is that there's a tremendous amount of noise in the political arena on this. And how can one then sort of go beyond this noise and then put our case and position more clearly? I mean, that's the question which exercises me. I mean, I don't have an answer to that, but looking from your position, how do you feel about it?
I think you hit the nail on the head, Tony. I really do. That's, we're in a different era now, and we can't just go along saying, well, Hong Kong has zero tariffs, zero quotas. It's got to be a better narrative than that, and we've got to get our messages out better, I think, than we are currently doing so, and that means not allowing or taking for granted relationships with the US, the EU, and other countries around the world for granted. I mean, I suppose, of course, from an economic point of view, Hong Kong would clearly see its future entwined to a degree with the mainland, and you have the Greater Bay Area initiative and all of that. But people outside will be thinking, okay, this is great. We understand that, why they're doing that, but where does it fit into my picture? And somehow we're not getting through to them, I feel. But like you, I don't have the answer.
I think that's one thing that we should begin to really think about, because I think the narrative is important, and people, and there's so much noise around that somehow we have to find a way of getting that narrative through. Maybe the AIL can do something about it.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
I think I can conclude by saying that Hong Kong has always been a law-abiding member of the WTO. You can see that we have never been named as a respondent to any complaints raised by other members. The message is how we can, and we also maintain our independent trade policy as protected by the basic law. And the issue is how can we get our message and image out better and clearer. And this is something I think Hong Kong government has to do, the right thing, to send out, to promote ourselves, and as well as defend our position as a separate custom territory. in the WTO regime. So thank you very much for tonight's speakers, Mr. Harbinson, Professor Lim, and of course Chairman Tony. Before we finish, I'm asked to remind the audience to do several things. First of all, you need to fill up your survey after the end of the session. And also, I'm asked, thank you, Ebrahim, for providing the technical backup or support for this webinar. And also, there are 3 upcoming events organized by the AAIL, the CISG Convention Forum, which is to be held on the 27th of September, the WG3, the ISDS reform on the 9th of November, and also, of course, our annual colloquium on the 3rd of December. So please look up our website and do sign up our events. Thank you and good night. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Stuart. Great
Thank
to
you,
see
everybody.
Thank
Great
you.
to see you. Great to see you.